The Bismarck Sea, March 1943. The northeast wind howled across gray waves as sudden tropical squalls lashed the dark, oil-colored sea. Through the mist and spray, a Japanese convoy crept southward, bows cutting silently through the swells. On deck, Japanese soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder soaked, exhausted after hours of fighting wind and water. They carried rifles, packs, crates of ammunition, and a firm belief that they were bound for the front line where Allied forces still held out. None of them knew that only a few hundred miles to the south, another kind of storm was gathering, not one of nature, but of steel and fire. The convoy consisted of 8 transports and 8 destroyer escorts, carrying nearly 7,000 troops of Japan's 51st Division. Departing from Rabolda fortified Japanese stronghold in the Bismarck archipelago, they sailed under cover of night on a mission of survival to reinforce the New Guinea front. If they reached Ley safely, the Japanese could push the Australians and Americans out of the region and secure a springboard toward the south, toward Australia itself, to Tokyo. This was a convoy of destiny. To their enemies, it was about to become a convoy of ghosts, 600 kilometers away, at Port Moresby. The mood was entirely different. Among the mist-rooted Owen Stanley Mountains, American and Australian airmen were preparing for something they had never been trained to. Dual altitude. Sea level battle. Inside a small shack of corrugated iron and sandbags, General George C. Kenney, commander of the U.S. 5th Air Force, bent over a map. His finger traced a blue line the route of the Japanese convoy, spotted that morning by reconnaissance. From Rabul to Laya, narrow corridor through shallow, reef-choked seas. A natural trap, if anyone dared to spring it. Kenney looked up, his weary eyes glinting. He knew this was the moment they had waited for. If they could destroy that convoy, Japan would lose its reinforcements. But if they failed, the consequences would be dire. The entire Southwest Pacific front could tilt toward the enemy. The problem was how to hit them. Throughout 1942, American airmen had learned a bitter lesson. There'd be 17 flying fortresses and be 25 Mitchells. Mighty as they were, flew to high 5, 10,000 feet above the sea, from flak, but too distant for accuracy. Their bombs splashed harmlessly wide, raising towering plumes of water as Japanese ships steamed on, ghost-like in the mist, unbothered and untouchable. Kenney had told his pilots, "We can't keep bombing the ocean and praying for luck." But at the time, he had no answer. Fresh reconnaissance photos from PBY Catalinas made him even more uneasy. The convoy zigzagged in tight formation, bristling with 25mm guns along every hull. Too high, and the bombs would miss. Too low, and the planes would be shredded in seconds. A deadly paradox. That night, as the lights in the operations bunker dimmed, Kenney stepped outside and stared into the black sky. He knew he needed something completely new, something the Japanese would never expect. And, by fortune, a group of reckless pilots in northern Australia had already begun to invent it. Major William Benn, commander of the 63rd Bomb Squadron, was the first to try an idea everyone else dismissed as madness. Skip bombing. "If you can make a stone skip across a pond," he said, "why not a bomb?" The line spread through the base like a joke, but Ben wasn't laughing. He went out to prove it. At a narrow bay near Townsville, Ben and his men stripped down their B-25s and practiced flying ultra-low. At barely 50 feet above the water, they dropped training bombs, watching them skip off the surface, bounce forward, and slam into wooden mock targets. Each success lit up Ben's face like a child discovering magic. But every magic trick has its price. Months later, Ben was killed in a training crash. His idea nearly died with him. Kenney heard the news, but didn't forget. He called together his best engineers and pilots, including Major Paul Pappy Gunn, a former mechanic from the Philippines who could turn scrap metal into weapons. Gunn looked at the B-25 and said, "This thing needs more teeth." He ripped out the Norden bombsight symbol of high altitude precision and painted a simple white crosshair on the windshield. Then he bolted 8.5 Okalaba machine guns to the nose, 4 more to the sides, and 2 to the top turret. The B-25 became a flying beast of steel and fire. When Kenney saw it, he grinned. Now we can bite back. The plan was set. 500-pound bombs with delayed fuses, dropped from just 200 feet, skipping across the waves into a ship's hull. The delay would give the bomb time to punch below decks before exploding. A single hit could sink a ship, but a second too early, and the blast would consume the bomber itself. On February 27, 1943, intelligence confirmed it. The Japanese convoy had left Rabo. Kenney immediately sounded the alarm. Crews were briefed. Bombs checked. Guns cleaned. In the mess hole, laughter came brittle and nervous. Everyone. Guinea. This was no ordinary mission. At Port Moresby that night, the parked B-25 Mitchells, A-20 Havocs, and Beaufighters sat silent under dim lights. Engines idle, yet you could almost hear them breathing. The sea breeze slipped through their propellers, carrying the scent of fuel, metal, and anticipation. Men in heavy flight suits passed each other without words, only nods. They all knew by morning the sea would burn red. Kenney stood at the end of the runway, staring northward. He remembered MacArthur's words. "We will not just hold New Guinea. We will retake it." But Tudor, that they needed a miracle. And that miracle, Kenney hoped, would come from the sky from men willing to fly just above the waves, where one heartbeat's mistake meant death. As the night wore on, waves broke on the shore like the slow drums of fate. Far out at sea, the Japanese convoy pressed on, unaware that, beyond the horizon, dozens of eyes were watching, waiting for dawn, and for the battle that history would remember as the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. A few hundred miles south of the New Guinea front, in the stifling heat of Queensland, Australia, a small airfield near Townsville throbbed with engines day and night. Red dust coated the B-25 Mitchells parked along the dirt runway. The smells of petrol, rubber, and hot metal mingled into the familiar perfume of war. There, a group of pilots and mechanics were attempting what headquarters called madness. Bombing at the height of a coconut tree, Major Pappy Gunn stepped out of the hangar with a cigarette between his lips, wearing a faded brown canvas cap. He wasn't a polished officer. He had oil-stained hands, smoke-squinted eyes, and a mechanical mind few could match. Gunn had been a civilian aeronautical engineer who lived in the Philippines before the war. When the Japanese invaded, he helped American forces and guerrillas escape Manila with planes he'd repaired himself. From then on, they called him the Propeller Wizard. Now the wizard stared at a B-25. Mitchell Media Mama, built to fly high and drop its loads from afar. He slapped the nose and muttered, "This thing doesn't have enough teeth to bite anyone." Then Gunn called the shop crew over and ordered the complete removal of the Nordine, Bamsaita, pride of the U.S. Army Air Forces. "It's useless at low altitude," he said. "I want guns instead of sights." They mounted 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns in the nose, 2 on each side of the fuselage, and added turrets on the dorsal and ventral positions. When they fired in tests, the whole aircraft shuddered like a roaring beast. Gunn laughed. "Now that's a real Michu." Others gave it a name that mixed reverence and feared the Stropha the Scourge. When General George Kenney came to inspect, he was astonished. "What have you turned it into, Pappy?" Gunn drew on his cigarette, pointed at the gun array and replied, "A creature that bites, sir." Kenney burst out laughing, then fell thoughtful. "Maybe we need a few more like that." But Gunn didn't stop at adding guns. He and the young pilots began training to fly extremely low 200 feet, sometimes as low as 50 feet above the water, close enough for the propellers to skim the waves. They learned to feel the terrain by instinct, to keep the plane steady while a bomb swung beneath the belly. They practiced dropping bombs with only a few seconds, delay so the bomb would hit the water, skip, and then smash into a ship's side. The first to conceive of the idea was Major William Ben, a young pilot of the 63rd Squadron. Ben had once watched children skip stones across a pond back home and thought, a bomb could do the same if you dared fly low enough. He got permission to test it and succeeded. The bombs skipped exactly as he predicted, striking wooden targets with terrifying accuracy. But fate denied Ben the chance to see his idea bear fruit. On a training flight at the end of 1942, his aircraft vanished in a storm and was never found. When word of Ben's death reached Townsville, Pappy Gunn fell silent. He took a photo of Ben smiling beside his Mitchell and pinned it to the hangar wall. "We'll carry on," he said. Not because of orders, but because of him. In the following days, pilots from the 90th Bomb Squadron were selected for training. Among them stood out a man named Major Edward Eddie Larner, tall, calm-eyed, with a voice like tempered steel. Larner had been an air racer before the war and was famed for his near-sixth-sense control of speed and altitude. He didn't speak much, but once in the cockpit, no one doubted him. The first training session began at dawn. B-25s lined up on the red earth runway, morning mist clouding the windshields. Lana climbed in, buckled up, and started the engines. The right R2-600S roared, shaking the ground. Gunn stood below, arms folded, shouting over the din. "Keep it at 200 feet. Don't let the bomb hit before it skips." "Understood." Larner gave a thumbs up and pulled the stick. The Mitchell surged forward, then immediately dipped, hugging the water. The crew held their breath. The sea rushed by so close you could see each little chop. Larner paced the speed 230 miles per hour, then pressed the release. The 500-pound bomb fell, struck the water, skipped, and detonated square on the steel mock target. A towering column of spray shot up. Gunn yelled, "That's it!" That's exactly it. Day after day, they trained until exhaustion. Many pilots slammed into the sea. One small misjudgment of angle and the aircraft would be sucked into the waves. Those who survived forced strained smiles, wiped sweat, and climbed back in. "If you're afraid, don't be a pilot," Larner said. The line became the squadron's motto. Meanwhile, in Port Moresby, General Kenney began to craft the strategy. He knew that to strike the Japanese convoy, they needed more than bombs' perfect coordination between aircraft types. He contacted the Royal Australian Air Force. The Australians would provide Bristol Beaufighters, powerful twin-engine fighters to lead the attack. Their job, fly very low and blast the convoy's decks with 20mm cannon, silencing the AA guns. Then Larner's B-25s would rush in and drop skip bombs to finish the job. This reckless plan was kept top secret. In the command briefing, Kenney spoke one short line. "If we fail, there won't be a second chance. On the ground. On the ground." Mechanics checked every bolt while pilots sat outside the camp, watching the sunset over the Owen Stanleys. No one spoke of death, but it hung in every breath. Some men wrote letters home and tucked them carefully into flight jackets just in case they did not return. Lorna did the same, penning for short lines. "If you read this, I flew too low, but I wouldn't trade that." The night before the battle, the base fell into silence. Insect chirps blended with the sea breeze. Intiangar B-25s were fueled and fitted with 500-pound bombs. With delayed fuses, Gunn walked around each aircraft, running his hand along the metal as if saying goodbye. When he reached Larner's plane, the young major sat on the wing staring toward the horizon. "You know, this is the most dangerous trip of your life, don't you?" "Gunn, ask it." Larner's smiled eyes, never leaving the skyline. "I don't think about danger, Pappy. I think about 200 feet. Gunn nodded. He knew this pilot was born for it. At dawn over Townsville, the sky flamed red. Engines started in unison, their roar echoing through the valley. B-25 Mitchells lifted from the ground in sequence, heading north toward the sea. Where the enemy steamed, propellers shredded the mist, reflecting the first sunlight like blades of silver. On the distant horizon, the Japanese convoy still sailed unaware. They could not know that within hours a new weapon born of the daring of men would come roaring from the sky, skip across the water, and turn the Bismarck Sea into a graveyard of steel. At dawn, on March 3rd, 1943, the Bismarck Sea lay cold and mirrored. Small waves lapped gently against the hulls of Japanese transports, reflecting the crimson glow of sunrise. On the deck of the flagship, Kyoka Sea, Japanese soldiers ate breakfast, white rice, dried fish, hot tea, unaware that a few hundred miles to the south, a storm of steel was forming. High above New Guinea, Major Edward Larner's formation of B-25 Mitchells had just crossed the Owen Stanley Range, heading straight for the sea. Below their wings stretched misty valleys, and silver threads of rivers. Larner checked the altimeter. 200 feet. The red numbers blinked on the panel like blood. He took a breath and spoke over the radio. Hold your altitude. No one climbs above 200. This isn't flying, this is racing death. Ha-Eduftim. A squadron of Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters led the way. The twin-engine aircraft, painted sea gray, skimmed the waves just a few dozen feet above the surface. In the cockpit, Flight Lieutenant Bob Mackenzie squinted through the sight of his 20mm Hispano cannon. A true Australian, gruff, quiet, but unflinching when he pulled the trigger. A small photo of his wife and daughter flapped on the panel in the wind. Remember, Bob, his commander had once told him, your job isn't to sink ships, it's to make sure they never look up. At 10 a.m., Japanese radar at Rabaul picked up faint blips on the screen so low they thought it was a malfunction. By the time the sound of engines thundered from the south, it was too late. Out of thin clouds, dozens of Beaufighters and B-25s swooped down like hawks Japanese. Anti-aircraft guns screamed, drawing arcs of orange fire across the blue sky. But the American and Australian pilots stayed low, skimming the sea, dodging flak with speed and instinct. The wind howled against their fuselages. Seawater sprayed across windshields. From a cockpit, you could see columns of water erupting just meters from the wingtips. Mackenzie led the first strike. He flipped off the safety and pulled the trigger. 16 20mm cannons roared, shredding the deck of the transport Maru. Japanese sailors fell as if swept by a storm. The ship's deck erupted in flames, its guns falling silent. As his Beaufighter roared past, Mackenzie shouted, "Clear path for the Mitchells." Larner dove into the smoke. His cockpit shook violently as 37mm shells burst behind him. Flak, 2 o'clock. Hi. His co-pilots yelled. Larner banked hard, skimming just 10 meters above the water, so low he could see his shadow racing on the waves. Bombs away. 2 500-pounders dropped from his belly, skipped off the surface just as they'd practiced hundreds of times in Townsville, and slammed into the Kyokose Maru. The explosions tore through the ship's ammunition hold, transforming it into a ball of fire. The blast sent a column of smoke hundreds of meters high and rocked Larner's aircraft. His windshield blackened with soot. When the smoke cleared, only twisted metal remained. Swirling in the waves high above, Captain Dick Muir, piloting the high-altitude bombers, watched the chaos unfold. He saw tracer lines, geysers of explosions, and B-25s dancing through hellfire. "Good God," he muttered. "They're flying low enough to scoop clams with their props." The Japanese responded with fury. Type 96 guns aboard escort ships poured out fire, weaving a deadly net of tracers. One B-25 took a hit. Flames engulfed its left wing. Number 4, bailout. Larner shouted into the radio. "No answer. Say. No answer." The Mitchell spiraled into the sea, burning a red star falling from the sky. But the others pressed on. Major John Hennebrey of the 13th Squadron dove straight at the Oga, remembering Pappy Gunn's words. Fly low enough to see their faces, then drop. At 150 feet, he saw Japanese sailors scrambling on deck, some looking up in terror. His bombs bounced once, twice, then punched through the hull. The explosion tore the ship apart. Metal shards rained into the sea. A pillar of black smoke blanketed the water. Hennebrey pulled up through the smoke, sweat soaking his back. "We did it," he gasped. "But hell won't forget us." All around, Beaufighters strafed the escorts. 20mm shells ripped through the bridge of the destroyer Shiroyuki, setting it ablaze. A B-25's bomb struck the Arasio, sending it careening into Nojima Maru. The two ships collided and went up in flames. From above, the Bismarck Sea was now a floating inferno. Black smoke blotted out the sun. The surface burned with slicks of oil like a mirror of fire. Japanese survivors flailed in the water, clutching debris, screaming for help. But no one heard them. The roar of engines and bombs drowned everything. Larner looked back over his shoulder. Smoke rose from 4 burning ships, one already sinking. Laughter and ragged cheers crackled over the radio. "We just turned the Bismarck Sea into a graveyard, Eddie." But it wasn't over. From the west, a group of Japanese Zero fighters swooped in from Rabaul, diving on the retreating Mitchell's gunner. "Get ready," Larner shouted. Tail gunner Sergeant Frank Davis swung his turret toward an incoming Zero and opened fire. Twin Brownings rattled, bullets ripping through the enemy's fuselage. The Zero burst into flames and spiraled into the sea, leaving a smoky scar across the sky. "Got him," Davis yelled, just as another Zero's rounds tore through their fuselage. Metal fragments sliced into Larner's shoulder. He gritted his teeth, blood soaking his flight suit. "I'm fine. We're still flying." He pulled the Mitchell up to 400 feet, out of the killing zone. By the time the formation returned to Port Moresby, the sun was dipping low and golden. The Mitchells landed 2 cheers and tears. Pappy Gunn stood by the runway, watching each plane roll in. When Larner climbed down, clutching his bleeding shoulder, Gunn said nothing. He simply saluted, then gripped his arm firmly. That evening, reconnaissance confirmed the scale of destruction. 8 transports and 4 escorts sunk. Nearly 3,000 Japanese, dead or missing. The entire Operation 81 convoy, Japan's vital resupply line to Leyte, was annihilated. Never before had the Empire of the Rising Sun suffered such loss in a single day. General Kenney listened to the report and said only one thing. This victory didn't come from bombs. It came from men who dared to fly low. That night, American and Australian pilots sat by a campfire, listening to the distant surf. They spoke little of glory, only gazed at the night sky, where moonlight gleamed on soot-covered wings. Larner sipped from his coffee can, eyes closed, hearing again the roar of wind at 200 feet, the sound of death and triumph, fused as one. Far out on the Bismarck Sea, Japanese wrecks still burned through the night. The flames reflected on the clouds like an open wound across the Pacific. And over that sea, the echo of the Loafleers endured a reminder that war is not only won by strength, but by the calculated courage of those willing to skim the edge of death. On March 3, 1943, as the B-25 Mitchells pulled away from the Bismarck Sea, smoke still billowed in the skies behind them. The Sea below, once a vital Japanese supply route, had become a floating graveyard. Ships lay torn apart, half sunk in the oil-slicked water. A thick black sheen covered the surface like a funeral shroud, glinting faintly with rainbow hues under the sun. Occasional explosions still echoed delayed magnetic bombs going off, or ammunition aboard shattered ships, igniting one last time. A few miles away, thousands of Japanese soldiers struggled in the water. They clung to planks, fuel drums, anything that would float. Their cries for help, mixed with the sound of the waves, hoarse, fading, and hopeless. Some waved weakly toward Rabaul, but no rescue came. The Imperial Navy, so proud of its creed to never abandon a comrade, was powerless now. The Bismarck had become a sea of blood and smoke, each wave carrying another corpse. Above them, B-17 flying fortresses arrived, hours too late. From 6,000 feet, the pilots could see burning wrecks, glowing like embers across the ocean. Major Raymond Wilkins of the 43rd Bomb Group ordered his gunners to hold their fire. "No targets left alive," he said quietly. "Only souls." But orders from Port Moresby were clear. Sink anything still afloat. And so, the attacks continued for 3 more days. March 3rd through 5th, 1943. History would remember it as the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. But for those who fought it, it was simply 3 days of hell march. Quattro Teache, a foggy morning, light rain drifting across the sea. Beneath the haze, Zero fighters from Rabaul flew desperately, searching for the lost convoy. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, 23, would later recall. "We looked down and saw the sea as black as ink. There were massive oil slicks, and within them, small specks moving our men. I have never forgotten that sight. Those specks were survivors. About 4,000 Japanese soldiers adrift among oil and debris. The sun scorched their burned skin. The stench of charred flesh and gasoline hung thick. Each change of wind brought back the reek of blood and smoke, making them gag. Many were covered in burns, their skin fused to the wreckage they clung to. Some prayed, others whispered for their mothers. A few sang the haunting military hymn, Yumi. Yukaba, if I must go upon the sea, I shall become the waves. But fate was crueler still. By noon, American radar detected movement. Small Japanese patrol boats racing in 2 rescue survivors. A terse order came down. Let no one escape. Major Hennebrie's B-25s and a squadron of P-38 Lightnings were dispatched from Dubud. They broke through the mist and rain to find a nightmare unfolding beneath them. A Bosch painting of hell. Crimson sea, drifting smoke, half-sunken ships. Hennebrie's voice crackled over the radio. My God, look what we've done. But the reply from command was cold. Stay on mission, Hennebrie. No emotion. He bit his lip, pushed the throttle forward, and dove. Bombs splashed down. Machine fire raked the rafts. Men in the water raised their hands in surrender. Others sang as bullets cut through them. Later, many American pilots admitted they never forgot what they saw that day. Lieutenant Bob Weaver wrote in his diary, "We no longer saw enemies, only men dying. I flew past and wanted to vomit. Below, Japanese survivors clung desperately to life. A few scrambled onto an overturned hull. Then another pass came. .5. O-caliber rounds tore the sea apart, painting it red. Those who could dove under the oil slick, holding their breath until their lungs burned. Some drifted north, hoping to reach rescue. But the cold currents of the Bismarck carried them farther away, toward the Solomons. Meanwhile, chaos reigned at Ribot. General Atas, Adachi, the architect of the operation, stood silently before his map, his hands trembling. His 15-ship convoy was gone. Only wreckage remained. All 6,912 soldiers, bound for Loe, lost. When asked about sending another convoy, he replied flatly, "There are no more routes. There are no more men." March 5th, 1943. The sea was still dark, but the fires had gone out. Smoke drifted low and heavy. American reconnaissance planes flew over, photographing the aftermath, overturned hulls, bodies floating among barrels of oil. The few remaining Japanese patrol boats risked everything to rescue survivors. They pulled up only a few hundred men burned, blinded, their skin peeling from salt and fuel. When asked their names, most did not answer. They only stared blankly at the horizon. At Port Moresby, the returning pilots sat in silence. No cheers, no celebration. In a dim tent, Major Edward Larner, hero of the battle, opened his logbook and wrote, "We won, but the Bismarck Sea swallowed a part of our souls. Elsewhere." Pappy Gunn wiped soot from his Mitch's propeller. "When told, sir, the convoy is being completely destroyed," he merely nodded. He knew every sunken ship meant thousands of dead men. Enemies, yes, but still human. 3 days later, the sea was calm again. The waves had erased most of the wreckage, leaving only drifting oil and rusting fragments. Sharks moved silently beneath the surface, finishing what the war had begun. Historians would later call it the worst convoy disaster in Japanese naval history. In just 3 days, Japan lost 8 transports for escorts, over 3,000 dead, 2,700 missing. Operation 81 was annihilated. The Leh garrison was isolated and would never recover. General Kenney cabled Washington, a victory of tactics, courage, and ingenuity, but also a reminder of war's true cost. That night, at Dobadura, American and Australian airmen sat by the fire once more. They didn't speak of the number of ships sunk, but of the friends who hadn't returned. Ben Foster Davis, names etched etched only in memory. Someone opened a can of beer, foam spilling onto the dirt. Larner raised his own can quietly. To those who flew lower than fear itself. Pappy Gunn smiled faintly and looked up at the stars. In the distant night, he almost thought he could hear the echo of the radar. 2600 engines. The growl of B-25s screaming across the sea at 200 feet, where life and death were separated by nothing but a skin of water. The Bismarck Sea lay silent again, but for those who had flown above it, the 3 days of hell would never fade. When the Bismarck Sea finally calmed, the waves carried only slicks of oil and charred driftwood. Over Port Moresby, the B-25 Mitchells touched down one by one, dust and fuel smoke curling into the afternoon sun. The pilots stepped out, faces dark with gunpowder smoke, eyes still lit with something between exhaustion and awe. They had just witnessed the impossible. An entire Japanese convoy wiped out in a few hours, not by luck, but by skill, ingenuity, and the courage of men who dared to fly just above the waves. Major Edward Larner climbed down from his cockpit, sweat streaking his flight collar. Sighed little. To him, victory wasn't a spectacle. It was proof that war could be bent by human intellect. When asked about the new tactic, he simply replied, "We just flew lower and hit harder." But to his comrades, Larner had done far more. He, along with Pappy Gunn, William Bin, and George Kenney, hadn't just won a battle. They had changed the way mankind thought about air warfare. At 5th Air Force Headquarters, General Kenney studied a map dotted with sunken ships and remarked, "We didn't just destroy a convoy. We shattered their faith that the sea was safe." Even General MacArthur, usually sparing with praise, sent a message. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea marks a turning point. From here on, Japan will only lose ground. Yet, amid the triumph, a quiet shadow crept in. On April 30th, 1943, less than 2 months after the battle, Major was killed in a landing accident returning to base. No gunfire, no flames, just a collapsed landing gear and a B-25 that skidded sideways on the runway. When the engines stopped, silence filled the airfield. The pilot who had flown lower than fear itself fell in a moment of peace. His comrades built a small marker beside the strip, engraved with simple words. He flew low and made history. From then on, Larner's name became legend among low-level attack pilots. They didn't honor him with speeches or medals, but by flying as he had low, precise, and unafraid. And skip bombing, the daring technique of bouncing bombs across the sea, spread throughout the Pacific. In the Solomons, the Philippines, even the Mediterranean, American, Australian, and British crews trained to drop their bombs at wave-top height. At the Townsville base, where Ben first tested the idea, instructors now shouted over the radio, "Don't fear the waves. The closer you fly, the truer you hit." The modified B-5s, bristling with .50 caliber machine guns, became the nightmare of the Imperial Navy. Japanese reports began to call them the symbols of death flying low. Teprase. Teprase. Low-flying bomber attacks appeared again and again, a new terror they could not stop. But the legacy of the low-flyers was more than a tactic. It was the fusion of science, daring, and courage. Ben, who conceived the idea, died before he saw its success. Gunn, who engineered it, lived to be called the Mad Mechanic, and kept inventing anyway. Larner, who executed it, was gone before he was honored, and Kenney, who allowed it, became the rare general in World War II willing to say, "I don't need miracles, I need men who will try." In the years that followed, doctrines of low-level attack were strategists realized that altitude no longer meant safety. Low was where surprise lived. From the Korean War to Vietnam, the idea of precision low-altitude strike evolved. From the A-1 Skyraider to the A-10 Thunderbolt, from piston bombers to jet fighters, all carried the DNA of skip bombing. Get close, see the target, and strike where it hurts most. Today, in U.S. Air Force training centers, a black and white photograph still hangs on the wall, taken from a B-5 cockpit over the Bismarck Sea, the ocean boiling with smoke, a ship erupting in flame, and a wing slicing just a few meters above the waves. Below it, a caption reads, "Courage is not the absence of fear. It is flying 200 feet above hell. And if you visit the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, you'll see a restored B-5D Mitchell, nose packed with machine guns, tail marked Pappy's Folly. On the small brass plaque beside it are the words, dedicated to the men of the 90th Squadron who flew low, fought hard, and never came back. When visitors stop to look at those gleaming guns, the guide tells the story of the young pilots at Port Moresby in 1943. The men who proved that intelligence and courage could bend even the laws of physics. In today's world, where laser-guided bombs can strike a single window, few remember the time when a pilot had to bounce a bomb off the sea to hit his target. But it was in that moment, when one man dared to fly lower, to challenge death itself, that the art of precision strike was born. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was not just a victory, it was a lesson in human limits and how to surpass them. Because war, in the end, is not only about steel and fire, but about intellect, bravery, and the will to do what others call impossible. And if you listen closely, among the winds over the Bismarck Sea today, you might still hear the distant roar of Wright cyclone engines, the thud of a bomb skipping off the water, and a young pilot's voice over the radio, whispering, "I have the target." Bombs. Hawaii. A flash. A ripple. Then silence. But the legacy of those who flew low has never faded.